Compare this with a criminal who is given every chance to prove his innocence. Who would not rather be a murderer and take the chance for life than be declared insane without hope of escape? Nellie Bly. Over Nellie Bly's lifetime, from 1864 to 1922, she accomplished many things that had never been done before, especially by women. She gave a voice to people and issues that hadn't been heard. Her unceasing curiosity and yearning for a good story helped her to overcome barriers that had never before been broken. While living in Pittsburgh, she read an article in a local newspaper that said working women were a monstrosity. Bly, knowing that in many cases it was necessary for women to work, and given that she was a working woman herself, decided to write an open letter in the newspaper that addressed the editor's insensitive, sexist remarks. The editor read the article and, rather than being mad, was so impressed by the letter that he hired her on as a writer for his paper and gave her the pen name of Nellie Bly. This is when Bly's whole life changed, and she then had her eyes set on a completely different goal from being a teacher. After a short while, she got bored and tired of being put down by her own company and left for New York in search of a more interesting, accommodating job. All she left behind was a note that read the following: "Dear QO, I'm off for New York. Look out for me. Bly." After a while, she found a job in New York. Almost immediately after being hired at the New York World, her editor, Joseph Pulitzer, proposed that she have herself declared insane and be committed to an insane asylum. She immediately accepted, not being able to turn away a chance for adventure. She started her operation by taking to the streets and wandered with a dazed look on her face. She then stayed the night at a boarding house, refusing to sleep, screeching, and practicing crazed looks in the mirror. Soon, she found herself being taken by the police to Bellevue Hospital, where she got a small taste of the awful, cruel treatment that was to come. The only blankets they had were moth-eaten, thin rags, and there was no source of heat. When they complained, the nurses would beat them and tell them that since they were poor, it was not their duty to care for them. After a few more acts of craziness at the hospital, she was taken before an insanity expert, then a judge, and quickly committed to Blackwell's Asylum, which is now Roosevelt Island in New York City's East River. But here let me say one thing. From the moment I entered the insane ward on the island, I made no attempt to keep up the assumed role of insanity. I talked and acted just as I do in ordinary life, yet strange to say, the more sanely I talked and acted, the crazier I was thought to be, by all except one physician, whose kindness and gentle ways I shall not soon forget. When she arrived at the asylum in the fall of 1887, Nellie Bly saw, felt, and heard things she would never forget. She found that the unsanitary, inhumane asylum was stuffing in over 1,600 patients, when its limit was supposed to be 1,000 people, and big budget cuts had led to a large decline in patient care. She quickly became friends with her fellow inmates and found out many of the horrific details. She came to realize that many of the women were not mentally ill at all, but merely poor immigrants, women with cruel husbands and no social safety nets. And while they may not have been mentally ill to begin with, the treatment had taken a toll on many of them. The women were made to take ice-cold baths and remain in wet clothes for hours, causing illnesses such as pneumonia. The water in the baths would remain unchanged until all of the women had bathed in the same water, and it was thick like a soup. This was again unsanitary and dangerous. Some of the patients would be tied to mule carts and laughed at by the nurses, while the women sobbed. Bly also recalls seeing women beaten until they were bleeding and bones were broken, and being shoved into jagged closets with sharp edges. The food would be moldy and the soup pink and watered down. The women slept locked away in cells, and each had complicated locks that had to be individually opened. In the case of a fire, the nurses would not be willing to open the prisoners' cells to save them, making the cells a death sentence. Patients would be threatened by being told that if they let the doctors know about the nurses' abuse, they would be killed, not that the doctors would believe them. There isn't much fear of hurting you. Shut up, or it'll get worse. These are the words Nellie Bly recalls hearing from the asylum nurses. Could I pass a week in the insane ward at Blackwell's Island? I said I could, and I would, and I did, said Nellie Bly after being released from Blackwell's Island after 10 days in what she called the madhouse. Her editor rescued her, and she was released.
22-year-old young woman with the wasp waist and waif-like appearance who not only survived it, but came out to write this harrowing tale and actually created change. There was a special appropriation made to improve conditions there in the aftermath of her report.
She could not leave the asylum and live on without having survivor's guilt. When she was at the asylum, she had written about the vicious, unethical treatment and turned the pieces into a series of articles that became a sensation. She wrote a book about her experiences as well. This book was called 10 Days in a Madhouse. Her book and articles sparked an investigation, and although the asylum attempted to do a quick cover-up, Judge Duffy agreed with Bly. The treatment in the asylums was unfair and awful. Almost immediately, funding increased immensely by $24 million, and nearly all of the victims Bly had mentioned meeting at the insane asylum were released. Almost all of the nurses she described were fired. She had broken the barrier of silence, imprisoning and oppressing the mentally ill. Throughout Nellie Bly's life, she brought change in many ways, challenged what was thought to be possible, and achieved many, many things. These included challenging the book Around the World in 80 Days by traveling it in 72 days, and exposing life under the Mexican dictator at the time. But perhaps her greatest achievement was accepting the offer to fake insanity and go on an undercover operation to expose life in an asylum, because it let the cry of terror from the imprisoned patients be heard by letting the world know what was really hidden away on Blackwell's Island. Asylums would have been much worse had it not been for Nellie Bly exposing their cruel treatment of the mentally ill and less fortunate of people. When Bly broke the barrier of ignorance by informing the public about institutional life, she not only revealed the horrors, but she also opened up people's hearts and minds to compassion. We can feel the impact of Nellie Bly's broken barriers when we see women being treated equally, women voting and having a much fairer say in their future. We can also remember Nellie Bly when we attend inclusive schools, and there are far more charities that help the less fortunate than can be counted. Nellie Bly, like Charles Dickens and many of the other greats, saw poverty and difference from a different point of view before many of these problems were even thought about. Nellie Bly's curiosity, love for adventure, compassion, and driven attitude made people see what desperately needed to be seen in a time when many people felt the truth was too hard to bear. I always had a desire to know asylum life more thoroughly, a desire to be convinced that the most helpless of God's creatures, the insane, were cared for kindly and properly.